Hello, I'm just taking a second here to get my PowerPoint up and we're off. All right, this is going to be the first of two videos this week, and this is talking about the period it's often called the Scramble for Africa. This is the period of widespread European conquest. And it really was, once it started, a scramble. European powers scrambling over each other, competing with each other to invade different parts of Africa, and it's kind of a mystery in some ways, because if we look at the continent, take a look. If you look at this map here, and this is what things look like roughly in 1880. Europeans had some possessions, especially in the south, as we covered last week. In the north as well, you had the French in Algeria and the British in Egypt. But other than that, then there are a few coastal enclaves you can see, especially in areas of West Africa. But the vast majority of the continent, as it's shown in white here, is under the control of Africans, right? As it should be, okay? But we go pretty quickly from that to this, which is a continent almost entirely carved up under, at least claimed, if not yet controlled, by European powers. And there are only two exceptions to that. One in West Africa, which would be the territory of Liberia, but that had been essentially colonized earlier, the 1830s or so, by African Americans who were either sent or wanted to come back to Africa. There's only one territory really on the continent which emerges unscathed from the Scramble for Africa period, and that's Ethiopia right here. Every place else, as you can see, once again, is carved up and claimed by European powers. The two countries that had the most territory would be Britain and France. And as you can see in the list here, but Belgium takes the Congo. Germany has several large territories. Italy has some territories, Portugal and Spain. So it was pretty widespread. Two questions about that. One is how? How did it happen that we went from a continent of Africa in 1880 with minimal European possessions, especially in the tropics, to one where nearly the entire continent was controlled by European countries? And secondly, why? You know, Europeans, we've seen for hundreds of years, have been coming to the African coast to conduct trade, right? Why this sudden desire to invade and conquer territory? All right, so that's what I'm going to deal with here today. The how is a little more straightforward. We're going to deal with that first. How Europeans conquered Africa. Really, we're talking about a difference in industrial technology. You know, roughly 1400, 1500, Europeans and Africans were pretty much equal in technology. But the Industrial Revolution, as it happens in the 18th into the 19th century, is going to move Europeans far ahead in technology. And that's going to include military technology, transportation, communications, and medicine. All of which is going to allow them the possibility or the ability to invade and conquer territory. And then secondly, as far as the process goes, you had the Berlin Conference of 1884-85, which really sort of kicked things off. And this was a meeting among European powers. The U.S. attended more as an observer, but there were no Africans there, other than whites from South Africa. But this was a conference to set the rules for partition and conquest. Now, you'll read some places the Berlin Conference, Europeans divided up the continent. That's not the case, okay? It just said these are the rules for partitioning Africa, mainly so that we don't start wars between ourselves. You know, the French and British in West Africa, or French or the English and Germans in East Africa, or whatever. So they said, you know, basically, if you wanted to conquer parts of the territory, you had to go in and boots on the ground claim it. And that's then what sparks off this scramble. Okay? But how then is really has to do with, as I said, technology, starting with military technology. I hope you watched this video already. If not, I'm going to take a drink of water. You can pause this, go watch it now, and come back. This is 5 minutes or so of the end of the movie Zulu. And I think what you see in there is pretty clear. Obviously, it's dramatized, but I've read the actual reports, and that actually happened. You had about 60 British soldiers who fought off thousands of Zulu warriors, and mainly due to firearms, as you see here. And we're not talking artillery or machine guns or whatever, but just the lethalness of a combat rifle, and also though it's the ammunition. And I ask you in the weekly agenda to stop the movie at 1:14 and ask what are those guys doing with that box. They're unloading ammunition. That's a box of ammo, and that's really important because that tells us something about the industrial power of Britain at this time. They can produce, tens of thousands of rounds of ammunition in factories, put it on a boat, ship it down to South Africa, and arm their troops. So, I mean, the weapons themselves, of course, are technology, but it's the ammunition also. And the resources that these European countries have is just something far beyond what African states and empires can have access to in most cases. Okay, there are a couple of exceptions. One is back to Ethiopia. Why is it Ethiopia, which was invaded by Italy, is the only place to survive the scramble for Africa as an independent state? And the short answer is because they could get access to up-to-date weapons. They used their trading connections through the Red Sea, and they bought modern guns. And they used those in a very effective way and defeated an army of Italians. Another person who was able to do that is this guy, Samori. He was a Muslim merchant and state builder in West Africa. And we're getting into the period of the class now, which is interesting because we can have photographs of people. There's a real person here. Samori Touré lived in, well, I'll show you, several places, frankly, but created this state here in West Africa that's outlined in orange. All right? He started out as a merchant of a Jula family, which are these Muslim merchant group, and he built an army to protect his trade and trade routes, and then it transitioned into a state, and then he became a fervent Muslim, so it became an Islamic state. Continued to expand, conquered surrounding states, built himself a kingdom. Incorporates gold fields, reaches the maximum size, and then the scramble for Africa happens. And the French in particular kept invading his territory. So he did something really incredible. First, he fights them off. And this goes on for almost 2 decades, actually. So, but he's able to use, he was a merchant. He's able to use his trading connections and his trade routes to import up-to-date weapons. And so he's able to hold the French off for a couple of decades. And at one point, he even shifts his empire, where it had been headquartered over here, and he moves it all the way over here, and basically moves his state. Just to get away from the French. Well, unfortunately, the scramble for Africa wasn't just the French in one place. It was pretty much a total invasion. So he ultimately is defeated in 1898. But it's also an example, though, of resistance. Africans resisted pretty much everywhere. So conquest was never easy, even if it was ultimately successful on the part of the Europeans. Once again, due to military technology, but also other things like transportation technology and steamships. Europeans are going to have steamships not only to connect Europe and Africa, but also within Africa, go up and down the rivers. They're going to put them on lakes and so on. And you see how much this was valued. The steamships are going to be important because they can carry a lot more, well, people, military material, but also trade back and forth between Europe and Africa, and they'll carry more and they'll go faster than sailing ships. And they looked something like this. The early ones still had sails, but you can see right in the middle there is the smokestack, right? So this has an engine in it. That's going to give Europeans an advantage. And you see another one here, once again rigged for sails, but with the smokestack there in the middle, and it's about trade. And you can see down at the bottom here how often they ran from Liverpool, which is in northwest England, to West Africa every Saturday, once a week. Okay, Liverpool to Southwest Africa every 3 weeks. Hamburg to West Africa, alternate Saturdays, and so on. So they create these regular shipping routes, right, to conduct trade. Communications technology. Europeans are going to develop the telegraph. And by the mid-19th century, you have telegraph systems widespread use across Europe, especially connected to railway systems. You see, even in the U.S., you see, if you drive out west, you see railroad tracks, and you see these lines running along the side of them. Those used to be telegraph lines. They were replaced by phone lines. And anyway, but also overseas. You have a transatlantic cable laid in 1866 and a cable from Britain to India. I mean, an actual cable. Okay, back in the day, telegraphs and phones had to go through actual lines, right? And so you wanted to talk overseas, you have to have a cable that stretches around the world. And that's what they did. And it's also going to give them a tremendous advantage in Africa. As they land on the coast, they'll string telegraph lines into the interior. And just during conquest, that's going to give them an advantage militarily because they'll be able to communicate. Medical technology is going to be very important, especially the development of quinine therapy. Quinine, if you don't know, is the derivative of a bark of a tree, and it's used to prevent and treat malaria, which is spread by mosquitoes. It's a parasite. The mosquitoes bite you and give you malaria. And for Europeans, it was extremely deadly. As you can see here, the British had troops in Sierra Leone in the early part of the 19th century, and the average death rate was 48% a year. Okay, 1 year it went up to 78%. But before the mid-19th century, Europeans coming to West Africa, about half of them would die in the first year. After that, the death rate would decline a little bit, but you can't maintain a force in particular or rule over a territory if you're losing half your people in a year. I mean, you just can't do it. But quinine is going to prevent and treat malaria. It's going to bring that mortality rate down to somewhere in the single digits. So it's going to make it possible for Europeans to come and stay in West Africa for a period of time. And if you want, take a look at this link here. It's slate.com, and it tells you about the origin of quinine and and the gin and tonic as a drink. It's kind of a fun little story there. So, how is it Europeans were able to invade and conquer? Technological advantages. Why they did it, though, is a little less clear. My professor in undergrad used to call this aggressive altruism. We're going to come and do what we think is best for you, whether you want it or not. And that's what you see in that poem, The White Man's Burden. If you haven't read that yet, pause me here and go read that. Put the link in the agenda. Okay, I hope you read it. Fun little fact, the author of that poem, Rudyard Kipling, also wrote the Jungle Book stories that, Disney movie and so on is based on. Yeah, anyway. But what you see in The White Man's Burden, I think, very much is, well, it's racism. We had developed by the late 19th century this extreme form of racism in Europe, where they felt that they were superior to every other race. Um, and you see that in that poem. It talks about the conquered peoples, the colonized peoples, as half devil and half child. Just not civilized at all. And so the Europeans felt they had this burden on their responsibility on them to go improve life for people in Africa. Europeans would talk about bringing the 3 C's to Africa: Christianity, commerce, and civilization. As if, of course, those things didn't exist there, right? Okay, well, that's where the racism comes in. It's arrogance too. Their other motivation was to stop the slave trade, which was still going on. Now, of course, Europeans by this time had convinced themselves that they had nothing to do with that. Everybody likes to rewrite history. So they had convinced themselves that the origin of the slave trade was within Africa, so the only way to stop it was to go in there and conquer the territory. Now, there were other larger contexts that lead to the scramble for Africa, too, I think. One is larger imperialism. Okay, you have this resurgence of imperialism by Europeans around the world, right? The British, of course, had lost their North American territories and a number of the territories in South America. So they're directing themselves other places, including India. You have British direct control over India in 1858. Okay? Well, for the British, this was something of a problem because you got to get to India. And that's where the Suez Canal fits in. If you don't know, the Suez Canal was dug primarily, planned by a French engineer, but this is in Egypt. And it links the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. And it's basically just a big ditch that connects the Mediterranean and Red Sea. And allows Europeans, and particularly the British, to sail directly from Europe down to the Indian Ocean, and it's a quicker route and more direct route to India. And that was very important for the British to be able to control India. Well, so they started to say, hey, we need control over India, and to control India, we have to use the Suez Canal. To assure that we can use the Suez Canal, we need control over Egypt. So the British start the effort to take over Egypt. Well, to hold Egypt means controlling the Nile River. Because if somebody else were to invade and dam the Nile, Egypt, pretty much can't survive. So the British then decided they needed to invade Sudan, through which the Nile flows, and so on and so on. And then so it becomes like a domino thing. Other motivations seem to be mineral discoveries. In South Africa, we have a huge diamond discovery, 1869, and gold in 1884. I think people are motivated to conquer territories because they don't know what's there, but there may be something else someplace else. Okay, which leads us to the final point, economics. I've got economics as a question mark here. I'm not convinced that Europeans invaded and conquered Africa for economic reasons. I wanted to show you here, if you can see where Egypt is right here in Northeast Africa, and the Suez Canal goes right through here. So Britain then could sail or take their steamships down here into the Mediterranean, down the Red Sea, Indian Ocean, and right to India. Whereas before, they had to sail all the way around Africa, which was one of their motivations for taking over South Africa in 1806 because of controlling the shipping lanes here. Anyway, back to economics. You do see, Europeans more economically involved with Africa. We see this booming commodity trade that we looked at a few weeks ago, especially with West Africa in the 19th century. Measured by value, it's even more important than the slave trade was. And this was, once again, palm oil, peanut oil, gum arabic, rubber, etc. Okay? Ivory as well. So you see here, exports of ivory from Congo. And this was controlled by the Belgian King Leopold. And you see by 1892, it's 67% of the exports from the area, and it's almost 4 million Belgian francs. All right. Well, that's going to be supplanted by rubber, okay? And you see rubber is going to boom from about 6% of exports to 86% of exports within a decade or so, 15 years, I guess. By 1905, rubber accounts for 43 million, almost 44 million Belgian francs. Once again, ivory was a tenth of that. Okay, so there's no doubt there are stronger economic connections between Europe and Africa. But I don't think they're strong enough or large enough really to motivate invasion for economic reasons. If you take a look at this, just before the scramble starts, as it gets started in about 1880, look at these percents. Britain's imports from Africa are 1.2% of their total trade. Their exports going to Africa are 1%. And half of this is with South Africa, which means the entire rest of the continent is 1/2 of 1% of their trade. Now, it's a little more for Portugal. Portugal, though, is a smaller, poorer country. So is it really a motivation to invade these territories, which is a huge undertaking militarily and therefore expensive, to ensure access to 1% of your trade? I'm not convinced of that. Now, it's definitely the case, and I will talk about this in the next video, it's definitely the case that once they conquered these territories, they wanted to make money from them. Absolutely. But I don't think it was a motivation going in. Okay? People like to focus on that because the other motivations seem to be a little squishier, right? I mean, aggressive altruism and so on, but it's true. And the French foreign minister was quoted as saying, France needs African colonies to be an imperial power, not to make a certain amount of money, but European countries were in competition to create empires, or else they felt they were just going to be secondary powers in Europe. And so that's really what it's about. That and the fact that they were now able to, after centuries of not being able to really, now they are able to, and so they're going to take advantage of it. Okay? All right, that's the scramble for Africa.